So let me begin then by recognizing our distinguished guests, excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, and I wish to thank Costa Rica, Sweden, the WHO, as well as the UN Foundation for partnering with us for this important event. All of us would be aware, and I'm sure all speakers have said, that COVID-19 laid bare the inadequacy of our pandemic prevention, preparedness, and response systems. It certainly tested our sense of solidarity as a global community when faced with a once-in-a-generation challenge that knows no bound. Today we meet just a few weeks after the adoption of a resolution calling for the convening of a high-level meeting on pandemic prevention, preparedness, and response, which was articulated during the 78th session of the General Assembly, which will be, we hope, adopted at the 78th session of the UN General Assembly next year. The outcome of that high-level meeting will be a declaration aimed at mobilizing political will at all levels for this very important objective. As South Africa, we look forward to working with all stakeholders to realize a successful high-level meeting. I think none of us would quarrel with the statement that we were certainly found unprepared. I recall the first 10 cases of virus in South Africa, and we thought, well, 10 in a few weeks, and then 3 weeks later it was over 100, and we realized we had a problem. And so we began convening as an emergency cabinet focused on COVID-19 and started to assess what we needed to do in order to respond. And I think one of the best decisions that our cabinet took right at the early stage was, let's get the scientists to become part of cabinet. And I think that is what helped South Africa. We of course had one of the worst experiences of the African continent, and we still need to study why. It's probably linked to our burden of HIV and AIDS and tuberculosis. But the fact of government working with scientists and taking the advice of scientists seriously made a real difference. It was the first time I saw in our country that you had a professor of infectious diseases addressing the nation on a constant basis and explaining without using the terms of microbiology in very clear terms to the public what was going on and why they needed to follow the restrictions that had been put in place. But all of us were tested, and clearly there's a lot we need to do in order to be ready for the next set of health emergency challenges. Our own public health system, as with many others throughout the world, was definitely overstretched. And I think we all watched in awe as our heroes and heroines, the health workers, rose to the occasion and went definitely beyond the call of duty and responded to assist us to confront this emergency. I think if it were possible, the Nobel Peace Prize should go to all health workers worldwide for the period 2019 to 2021. Really. If it was possible, that's what I would say we should all call for. We meet today fully realizing that we may and probably will face similar pandemics in the future. Our discussion is intended to identify the key elements of a future pandemic prevention, preparedness, and response system. I wish to comment on some of what we think might be considered. Firstly, we are saying that leadership is key. Effective prevention, preparedness, and responsiveness requires a leadership that transcends narrow national interests and realizes that only by collaborating and working together can we address global pandemics. So from our own perspective, we put in place or agreed on a range of regulatory changes and public restrictions. But we became fully alert to the fact that as the party in government, we could not make these decisions alone. That we had to consult all political parties, that we had to speak to the different sectors. So if you didn't have the religious community behind you, you had those mad people arguing against vaccines. If you didn't have traditional leaders with you, you couldn't get vaccines to rural communities. So you had to have a wide sectoral engagement in order to ensure that all of us act in concert. So leadership, absolutely important. You can't, at that point of emergency, focus on narrow national interests, because this will definitely prove short-sighted and will prolong the pandemic. So we were really keen that we should engage and that everybody should be as informed as is possible as we become more and more informed about this challenge, because we didn't know everything. Secondly, our systems of global governance for pandemic management do require reform. We are really pleased with the ongoing efforts to strengthen the WHO, its systems and mechanisms. And we've been fairly vocal about our belief that we don't need another body to duplicate the WHO. We need mechanisms that fall within the ambit of this important body and work in close direction and coordination with it. We don't believe we need another institution, and I think we need to be very careful. I know we like to form institutions because it gives us a job and money and all of that stuff, but we think WHO is the premier global health body, and it has a repository of experience and skill that we all should draw on. We believe that WHO stood out as a beacon providing scientific and technical leadership for the management of the pandemic, and I think they did really well. For developing countries, WHO became the main source of sound, credible, and unbiased information. We knew that they weren't trying to rip off Africa when they spoke to our governments and our stakeholders. Furthermore, we need to build partnerships with and support regional mechanisms such as the Africa CDC for them to reach their full potential. Our Africa CDC was at quite its early stage of formation, but because it formed a very strong alliance with the WHO, it served Africa really well. And we've now cemented its sustainability under the rubric of the African Union because it played such an important role. And I'm really looking forward to us enhancing capacity within the African CDC to ensure that we build both the scientific, innovation, and human resource ability to react and respond when required. Third important point is that sustainable financing will be an important component for a successful pandemic prevention, preparedness, and response system in the future. The investment needed, we think, is small compared to the devastation that a pandemic of the magnitude of COVID-19 can cause. Probably from our perspective, we should make all the alcohol companies pay much more money because we actually had to pause access to alcohol for some time to free up beds in hospitals. And the alcohol community took us to court all the time. But we were firm in our resolve, and we freed up those beds and were able to treat real patients. So maybe the money lying within the alcohol sector can help us to respond to the problems that we have of financing. According to the UN, by the end of 2023, many developing countries will not have achieved the GDP growth they had before 2019. Jobs were lost and many businesses closed permanently. Thus, seriously investing in and funding pandemic prevention is in the collective interest of all of us. It will help us to save jobs, livelihoods, and businesses. We're encouraged by the efforts of the G20 in this regard, with the commitments made at the latest meeting of the G20 in Bali, Indonesia. But we also realize that all countries and international finance institutions need to be part of the conversation on financing. If we don't solve the financing matter, I think everything we try will actually not result in success. Fourth and final point, vaccines work, they do work, despite one of our judges saying that they are the invention of Satan, they work, and they need to be distributed equally at all times. Americans will always be at the back of the queue of solutions, and we can't afford that again. So investing in vaccine production is really important. We appreciate the governments and many stakeholders who have supported our call for a COVID-19 waiver, a temporary waiver to the WTO TRIPS agreement. And we think that that first agreement, which is a term-limited agreement on a waiver of access to intellectual property for vaccines, that we need to look at expanding it to diagnostics because it can't be limited to one part of what is in the production line and what actually assists in dealing with health emergencies. So we hope that when we call once more for a waiver on other aspects of diagnostics and other aspects that are relevant to responding to a health emergency, that everybody will support these calls, which are essentially about equality, about global solidarity, and about ensuring that no one is left behind. We believe that access to treatment is a fundamental human right, and it is one all of us should strive to ensure we achieve. So having laid out those 4 key elements that we believe should be part of the response, we look forward most sincerely to the exchange of views that will take place at this meeting. Thank you very much to you all for being here.
Thank you so much, Honorable Minister. What a powerful blueprint you've laid out for the global community, for the people in this room to help take forward. And I'm sure we'll be breaking down some of those themes that you brought up, some of those recommendations in the conversation to come.